Alright, so I never know what combination of influences or circumstances might lead to my next project. Although I knew I had hardware left over from the Pacific builds that could probably end up becoming some kind of Pacific kit or another, I had no idea it was going to go in the direction that it did. Now, the inspiration for this project is as varied as a drummer that maybe not too many people have heard of, all the way up to Neil Peart, and all of it kind of focused around the same basic drum setup. Well, maybe not such a basic drum setup, but you'll see what I'm talking about. I also was looking to hit a couple of other checkboxes in some drum build or another. I didn't know it would be as soon as this one, but I'm kind of glad it did because it all worked out. So the goal of building this drum kit was to recreate a Neil Peart style kit. However, given the dimensions of the original, which used a lot of unusual sizes as modern drum sets go, what I came up with instead uses more ordinary common drum sizes, and in so doing kind of scales everything down by one drum size. As a result of this, the kit still retains the correct look, even though the drums are objectively the wrong size. Now, because of the surplus of Pacific goodies that I had laying around, it was decided that, okay, we're going to build this using Pacific parts. However, I was short by one drum kit, and by that I mean 3 tom-toms and a bass drum. Now, I decided I wasn't going to pull the trigger on this project until I found these drums, but it ended up taking up less than a week to find the kit that I needed, and once I had that in-house, then it was time to put things together. Now, for most of the drum hardware, it wasn't a problem. It was already clean. I kind of knew everything was in the proper shape. However, with the drums that I ordered, they're another coastal kit, and I've discussed these before, where my theory is that being that close to the humidity in the sea and the salt in the air and whatever, it tends to corrode parts of the drum kit, whether anybody likes it or not. And the inside of this drum kit was probably by far the worst I've ever seen. I mean, honestly, should humans even touch that? The outside cleaned right up, nice and easy, but the inside had a lot of rust on the lug mounting screws. And so I had to be very careful about taking these apart so I wouldn't break anything off inside the hardware itself. Now, in addition to stripping the hardware, I also had to take off the badges, and these were older Pacific drums that had the air grommets pressed in. So those had to be removed, which I did by using a hacksaw blade in my jigsaw, giving it a couple of quick cuts in the shell, and then using needle nose pliers to pry the brass pieces out of the hole and clear that out. Now, the woodworking on these drums was fairly simple. Most of the shells were in the correct size and depth that I was going to use. Mostly what I ended up doing was plugging any unwanted holes, such as the original badge or air vent mounting locations. Now, some of the other drums, like tom-tom shells that had to be converted into concert toms, not only had to have their badge and air vent holes plugged, but also the lower lug mounts around the drum. Each one of those required at least a dozen plugs to fill in all the holes, which I do using just off-the-shelf dowel sizes, which I'll taper down in my drill against a sanding block, then apply some Titebond 3 wood glue and use the drill to drive them into the hole, basically making the peg as tight into the shell as I can. Then I'll back the drill off, leaving the peg in the drum to dry. Once those are done, I'll cut off the outsides and sand them smooth. Now, I don't worry about the insides of the shells at this point because I know when I'm doing a wrapped kit, I would never do this trick on a stained kit or a painted kit necessarily. But on a wrapped kit, what I'm waiting for before I cut off the insides is to get the glue and the wrap around the outside of the shell so that that end of the plug is glued to the inside of the wrap, and it just, in my mind, kind of reinforces the bond there. And then I feel like it's safe to cut off the excess pegs on the inside of the shell and start sanding that part smooth. Some other work that needed to be done on the shells was cutting the depth down. Now, in the case of the bass drums, there was a strategic reason for this. I could have gone with 18-inch deep bass drums. However, I planned on using the stock Pacific tom-tom mounts because I didn't feel like going through the extra work of plugging holes that size. I mean, the main mounting hole is like this big. So I didn't want to go through all that. And I wanted to use those tom-tom mounts to my advantage when doing a Neil Peart style setup, since back during those days he was mounting his tom-toms and other accessories directly onto the bass drums. So, by cutting 4 inches off the batter side of a Pacific bass drum, it not only gets you the shorter, more traditionally sized bass drum, it also eliminated half of the lug mounting holes on one of the bass drum shells, which I had to take from a 10 lug drum down to an 8 lug drum. It also has the effect of moving the tom-tom mount 4 inches closer to the playing position, which is something else I was looking to do. I don't need my tom-toms way out here. I tend to play with my bass drums farther out in front of me than most. Thus, there is kind of a need to have the tom-toms remain in the same position while the actual playing position of the bass drum goes farther away from me. But either way, it all ended up working. Now, most of the shells are recycled stock Pacific drum shells. Mostly MX series, since I don't have to peel a wrap off of them. I can just sand down the outside, apply the glue, and wrap them up as I would a regular brand new Keller drum shell. That said, I did have to bring in some fresh Keller shells for the 6-inch tom, the 16-inch floor tom, and the 20-inch gong drum. Yes, I'm making a gong drum for this set. The 6-inch and the 16 and the 20 should be obvious. There were never really a lot of Pacific drums made in those sizes. Yes, 16 was a common catalog size for a floor tom, but if you have ever looked around there are guys struggling and hunting and scraping to find 16-inch factory-issued Pacific floor toms, at least in the oval lug series of drums that I tend to prefer. So I didn't have a 16 just kicking around. I had to buy a new Keller shell for that. One of the 8-inch concert toms ended up using a surplus piece of 7x8 Keller shell that I just happened to have kicking around. That one was a perfect fit because the bottom of the concert tom shell was already blunted flat, so I didn't have to cut a bearing edge off the way I would on a stock Pacific shell. And the whole reason I keep these shell cutoffs and extras around is precisely so that I can use them in a project like this. So what a golden opportunity. So once the woodworking was done, it was time to wrap the drums. So I've observed doing other wraps that any imperfections underneath the wrap will show up through there. A little speck of grit in between the wrap and the shell will show up like a mountaintop if it's done in chrome. So I took extra care to make sure things were clean. If I had to use the tip of a razor blade or anything like that to pick a little piece of grit or dirt or a cat hair or anything off of the shell or the back of the wrap when I was gluing things up, I took the time to do that. Now, the good news is the chrome wrap that I ordered from Precision Drum Company for this project is actually on a slightly thicker base than most of your normal drum wraps. So the advantage there is that it's not as susceptible to peaking or sharp bends if something happens to be underneath it trying to poke upwards. It's not that it's not a consideration, but it's less susceptible to it. The greater danger with this stuff is if it is dented in any way from the outside. That will show up, and so one of the downsides of having a chrome drum set, besides them being difficult to keep clean, is that they are extremely susceptible to damage. I might actually buy a set of cases just for this drum set. In any case, I tried to do the wrap in kind of an assembly line fashion, laying out the pieces, applying the red Tessa tape at the overlap end, and then sanding and gluing both the back side of the wrap and the shells that were getting ready to receive each piece of wrap. Now, if I was able to do so, I did try to cut the pieces for each shell slightly oversized so that it gave me a little bit of wiggle room in terms of the alignment. However, if the alignment is super critical, and this is a trick I've been doing ever since I started doing these things, I'll roll out enough wax paper in between the wrap and the shell to keep the glue from adhering and do a few test rolls until I'm confident that the alignment of the wrap and the shell are where I want them to be. Then, once it's ready, I can pull the wax paper out, roll the wrap onto the shell, and then use the J-roller to press everything down and make sure there are no air bubbles in there. But the work went fairly quickly, and in no time, everything was ready to lay out for hardware locations and to start the drilling. One of the advantages of working with a wrapped finish is that they generally come with a protective film around the finish side. And after I wrap a drum, I've learned don't peel this film off just yet. Peel off enough to do your seam overlap and everything like that, but otherwise leave it on the drum because we're going to use this to our advantage when it comes time to do shell layout and hole drilling. Now, I still use masking tape as my marking surface when laying out the hardware on a drum because it takes the tip of a ballpoint pen better. And I like to use a ballpoint pen because the line remains consistent. I don't have to sharpen it like I would a pencil, and Sharpies and other kinds of markers tend to be too wide for any real precision. So once I've approximated the location of my tape strips, then I can start laying out the drilling locations, and then it's time to fire up my trusty unibit and start making some holes. Now, hot tip for using one of these unibits, I actually take a permanent marker, run the bit in reverse, and mark every other step on the bit like a raccoon tail, and in that way I kind of have a quick visual reference on how deep I'm actually going so that I can keep my hole sizes consistent even though I've got this step bit. And that saves me the trouble of having to put a piece of tape around the bit to mark each particular hole depth, especially because those pieces of tape will start to wear out by the time you get about half the lug holes drilled. Now, the permanent marker starts to wear out too, so in order to combat that little problem, I start by drilling my smallest holes first, usually the badge locations, and then start working up to progressively larger and larger holes. So in my case, it would be badge holes, floor tom mounting holes, lug mounting holes, and then air vent holes. Now, the other advantage to leaving the protective film on the wrap when you're doing all of this stuff is that once you finish drilling all the holes and you're absolutely certain everything has been done right, instead of having to peel each piece of tape off, you just peel the entire wrap off and it takes all the tape up with it. One clean shot. Isn't drum making fun? With this finish, because it's chrome, it's a fingerprint magnet, so while I was doing a lot of the handling and assembly on these, I actually bought a pack of white cotton gloves. Basically, anytime I'm handling this kit, I literally give it the white glove treatment. Some of the mounting screws for the lugs were pretty badly rusted. Now, I tried the Mike Malone trick of soaking them in WD-40, but there are some things that WD-40 just can't fix. Now, there might be some solution down the road for these things, so I put them in a parts drawer to await that solution. Until then, I went out and got the appropriately sized and threaded screws from the hardware store, just got a 100-pack of them, and some washers and lock washers, and those will serve as a fine stand-in on drums that I didn't want those crusty, rusty old screws touching. Now, on some of the other drums, specifically the Pacific tom-tom shells, some of those already had rust staining on the inside of the shells directly underneath the lug mounting washer, and that rust spot was never ever coming out of there, so I wasn't as fussy about those. But in any case, that leaves us with enough drums to make a Neil Peart style drum setup, so let's see and hear how it came out. Alright, so we'll do a short tour of the kit here. So we've got 5x6, 6x8, 7x8, and 8x10 concert toms. We've got 8x10, 9x12, 12x14 rack toms, a 14x16 floor tom, a 14x20-inch gong drum, and I think I'll be making a separate video about that because the way it's built is something that could apply kind of to any drum. And so that might be worthy of a video on its own. And then the bass drums are 14x22s. And I haven't built the snare or the timbales yet. Those will also be getting their own videos. So in its stead, I've got my original number one, my old 50s or 60s Gretsch chrome over brass round badge snare. And then the cymbals are mostly Sabian. I got a couple of Istanbul slashes and of course the Wuhan China here. And the cowbell tree, I actually had to go hunt these down. So the tri-bells are from Pearl, and then I looked up Neil's specs around the time that he first started putting this little concoction together, and ended up getting a Latin percussion Black Beauty and Latin percussion, I think it's a rock cowbell. And so they all seem to sound right. They sound like Neil's cowbells, so that's a lot of fun. And this entire design was inspired by a guy named Reed Hayes, who decided to build kind of his own version of Neil's El Darko kit. But he wasn't going to do that using the highly expensive DW drums, so he used Pacific drums instead. And the genius of doing that is that you can basically get the correct look while using scaled down sizes, and it was all made possible because when Pacific first started making these oval lug drums and upgraded to the suspension mounts and everything like that, they started doing their 14-inch floor toms as either a rack tom or a suspended floor tom version using the suspension tom mount. And that's the part you need with the hardware you need in order to ape the look of that big 15-inch rack tom that Neil used to have in that position. So that's why if you pause and look at the diagrams that I put out there, you can see that he was actually using 12, 13, 15, 18, whereas with the Pacific drums, you end up with 10, 12, 14, 16, which are all, of course, one size down from the original. While it's true that this is specifically built to be the Neil Peart setup, the fact is there are so many drums here, especially of rather common, ordinary sizes, that, of course, as a drum kit, it can be reconfigured into any setup that I would like, including setups that are more reflective of my current setup ideas rather than something that I was super obsessed with back in high school. My, what a difference 30 years makes. And I had said that I wanted to check off a few boxes. One of those boxes was that I wanted to build a chrome drum kit, kind of a high school teenage dream drum kit revival, if you will. And as a bonus, using the Pacific/DW hardware on this was kind of a nice touch for me because I kind of like the way that DW and Pacific's suspension mounting system looks on a chrome background, as it is a chrome part itself. So basically everything blends in except for the little rubber rings around the lugs. I always thought that was kind of a nice look. So I was glad to be able to try that out on a Pacific drum kit, and as far as I can remember, mirror chrome is a finish that PDP never put on the oval lug drums. In fact, I don't think they've used it on anything that wasn't made out of a metal shell. So not only did I get kind of a Neil Peart tribute/replica kit out of the deal, I also got a pretty versatile collection of drums that can be reconfigured or repackaged in any way that could meet any need I might have in the present or possibly the future. It's a fun little curiosity as well that after almost 40 years of being a drummer, this is only the third double bass setup that I've had that uses matching bass drums that both came from the same place, were the same color, the same finish, same manufacturer. So yes, I've had numerous double bass kits over the years, but not all of them matched. I came close with Project 303 because I had a second 18-inch bass drum, but ultimately the hardware from one of those drums is now the hardware for a 22-inch bass drum in this setup. So that's my latest build, and because of its relatively neutral and basic color, we're going to start seeing parts of this kit appearing in other videos to discuss other cool drumming objects. So stay tuned for some of that in the future. So anyway, that's enough about this shiny little monster. I'm Mike Lindsay. Thanks for coming out.